We touched a little bit on it last night about the continued impacts on Native people, Native women, Native lands, and how those impacts are still being perpetuated through all the different oppressions that we face as people. And it's what happened to our ancestors is still, we're still needing to heal from that. We're still needing to release it, to talk about it. And so that's what we want to do today, is bring that experience of our grandparents into this discussion, and how that experience is still relevant today, how it is still inhibiting our ability to heal and move forward in strong and strength and wellness, because we're still carrying a lot of that internalized, colonized mindset within ourselves, and that we act out against each other. And it's until we really recognize the root of that first violence that happened to Native peoples here, and it's not going to get any better anytime soon. And so thinking about the 500 plus years of genocide and colonization on Native peoples of Turtle Island, and how that was not only a physical genocide, but it was also a cultural genocide, to the place where we're having to reclaim, like we're talking about, a lot of the ceremonies that were disappeared, a lot of the rituals that were taken, a lot of the shame and guilt and anger that is still being born in our young people, despite our best intentions. So we're going to ask for 7 volunteers, from eldest to youngest. If we could have some hands, anybody who'd want to volunteer?
Just sit in the chairs.
Okay, come on up. And just I'll let you seat yourself wherever you feel, the eldest generation to the youngest. So this represents the 7th generation onto the current generation. And we might think of generations as being mother, daughter, granddaughter, but try to think of it as mother, daughter, granddaughter being one generation. So 3 living is one generation. So that's how far back we're going. And I'm going to let Anne-Marie talk a little bit about the history of what happened to Native people here 500 years ago, up to...
It's still happening.
Still happening, up to the theft of land, the mass murders, the genocide, what happened with the theft of our children in Native boarding schools, just to bring that history of what happened to our ancestors this far back.
My mother attended a boarding school, and it was in Santa Cruz. It was the Holy Cross. It was just perhaps 2 years ago, I heard a story about the boarding schools. My mother did not talk about the boarding schools to me. I think she did not want me to be exposed to it. But a story I did hear, I would like to share with you. It was in San Jose, California, and the gentleman came in. He was from the Pine Ridge Reservation. And he shared the story about this grandmother, and she had a beautiful, beautiful granddaughter, 10 years old. And the granddaughter was learning her language. And she was so proud and so happy. And she ran into her grandmother's house and started talking in Lakota. And her grandmother just swung out, knocked her down, and was devastated. Why this action took place. And it took 4 days before the grandmother asked her daughter to bring her granddaughter to her home. And she explained why. Granddaughter, do you see this finger here? that I don't have any tip? Do you see this finger here that doesn't have any tip? When I was 9 years old, I was sent to a boarding school. We were not to talk or speak in our language at all. I did not understand, so I spoke. And some of my friends said, don't. And I didn't understand what was being said. So after the third time or fourth time that I spoke in my language, I was asked to go to the principal's office. The principal took me to another office where they cut off the tip of my finger. They put salve on it and sent me back to class. And I didn't say a word for about 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, and I still did not understand what was going on. And so I spoke, somebody please explain to me what they are saying, because I don't understand. That's when the same action took place again. I was sent to the principal's, then I was sent to another room, and this finger was cut off. And salve was put on it, bandaged up, then I was sent back, and I never spoke my language since then. And when I heard you speak my language, our language, it was just automatic. Her reaction. It's intergenerational trauma. It's still here. It's still very, very real. That's what you asked me to share? Okay, thank you.
So at that time, I might need help with holding the mic. So at that time, our ancestors, some of them were still dealing with the encroachment of our lands and the theft of our lands. At this time, much of the eastern part of the continent had already been mass murdered, had already been lost to disease and illness, and were forced off their lands, relocated on death marches, relocated to concentration camps that we now call reservations, away from their traditional foods, away from their lifestyles, away from that connection of place that we were talking about last night. And where we were from in the Southwest, we were starting to just see the beginnings of that encroachment on our peoples, where our leaders were trying to journey to Washington, where they saw this modern civilization for the first time and were impressed. We're also worried about why were all these European settlers coming to our land and just making themselves at home, and there was, it was starting to get where they were intruding on our sacred spaces. At that time, we had no concept of land ownership. We had no concept of any of the current laws that were being enacted. And so they were journeying to go and see what was happening with that. And all the harms that she was talking about with this generation, it wasn't talked about. There was that shame and anger and silencing. And so the bag was closed, our ability to speak about what was happening with the women, because at that time patriarchy was also replacing our matrilineal societies, where our women were honored as equal of value to the role of men, where the energies within us of that's male and female were no longer recognized, where men were being forced to shut off their female energy, making them deal with a lot of oppression that they hadn't experienced, that they were then acting out on the women in their communities. So that first generation, those maybe 3 harms that might have happened, it could have been more, that's closed. So the second generation, they're born, it's still not talked about, so this has to go. Let's see where they put it. They not only inherit what happened to their grandmother, now they have another set of challenges. And that goes into that bag of trauma. And so maybe where we're from, maybe we're still My great-great-great-grandmothers were still wearing their traditional clothes. They were still speaking their native language. Maybe they spoke more than one language. But at the same time, this concept of owning our mother was put into place. And there was a lot of violence is being acted on the plant people, on the animal relatives, on as far as just seen as an object that could be taken to build this new civilization that was coming, this dominant culture. And so whatever happened to this generation, it also wasn't, we were shamed that, oh, your healers aren't good, that they're dirty, they're unsanitary. Our midwives were shamed out of existence. We're saying, oh, your culture isn't worth protecting or for saving. You have to learn how to be white. You have to learn how to be educated in our ways, and that's the only way we'll be able to live together and coexist. It was a choice of either mass murder or assimilation, and they realized they couldn't keep on doing that, so they chose the cultural genocide that started with the boarding schools, with the continued theft of land through whatever legal mumbo jumbo was happening. So the next generation, all those harms that were passed on, weren't spoken about. And it's multiplied. It's exponential harm. So right now we're 3 times 3 times 3, which is 27. And maybe at this time we're starting to come back from the boarding schools and not dress in our traditional ways. We're not speaking our languages anymore. We can no longer communicate with our grandparents. There's maybe very few people that are able to accept that we don't have to let what's dear to us go. Maybe at this time, alcohol is starting to be introduced into our communities, where we're starting to be violent against each other and abusive against each other. We're starting to get hit. We're starting to get raped in our homes. We're starting to get abused. We're hungry from the poverty because we're disconnected from our land use and how we did that. Can you pass that forward? So this generation, we're not understanding why we're being born with all of this hurt, why we're not understanding why our grandparents are so silent and angry. Maybe we can't even speak to them anymore because we speak English and they only speak their traditional language, and so we're cut off from even communicating with our elders, where that knowledge is cut from us and we don't know what it is we're missing, why we have this empty space inside of us. Can this one go?
It's okay, just.
Pass that forward.
So in the boarding school era, they came for children. And like our sister from Canada was saying last night, that young boy got hit by his grandparents. They had to hide him. So some of them went into hiding, but some of them were caught and dragged away from their parents trying to hold them. Their grandma and grandpa trying to hold them. And they're crying. The parents, the grandparents are crying. Have you ever seen rabbit-proof fence?
Yes.
Same thing. That's in Australia, where the kids were also called the stolen generation. They were taken from their homes and placed into non-indigenous homes in Australia. So this is worldwide that this happened. And so one of the grandmas from San Juan Pueblo also talked about it. She said her grandma was crying when she was being taken. And she said she was in a boarding school and she would visit this one little boy that was in there sick. And that little boy would ask for an orange, he would say. And I guess he was thirsty, he wanted an orange. So that the grandma, when she was a little girl, her grandma sent her with a trunk. And it was packed with not clothes, but food. So she went to her trunk and she found an orange there. So she took it to that little boy and he had a smile. And then they have an Indian hospital next door to the boarding school in Santa Fe. And so he ended up in the hospital and he passed away from loneliness.
Our men were also starting to participate in U.S. warfare. Even though we weren't granted citizen rights, even though we couldn't vote, we were still allowed to go to other places and enact harm, enact way that was counter to the way we were trained as to be warriors. The way we go through ritual and purification when it comes to the possibility of having to take a life, that preparation wasn't happened when they went to war. And so as a result, World War II, World War I, Vietnam War, our fathers were coming back violent, angry, abusive, and we had to endure that. Even despite all this history, we still had that patriotism, and that was exploited. And now with these generations, can you pass that? Pass it around. So not only are we dealing with this kind of violence in our homes that we had never experienced before, but now our fathers were forced to go somewhere and kill people who looked like us. Vietnam War, one of our taseros was, he was really hard because it was like they looked like him. And no wonder he came back addicted, alcoholic, abusive, unable to be his emotional feminine self inside. And at this time we also had an extreme act of violence on our home place. You know, there's history that the first atomic bomb was on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it was actually on the indigenous people of New Mexico with the Trinity test. And so 1945, that explosion was an extreme act of violence that was also recorded in our DNA, that was recorded in our sacred places. Where at this point now, where once all of everything was sacred, now we only had these little places that were given permission, okay, that can be sacred, that can be, but even now we're still having to fight for those little pockets of what we're allowed to call sacred. And so even that erasure of that consciousness of everything having that hallowed ability has been erased. So our nuclear waste dump to me is sacred. The water that's hurting and has been harmed from violence to where it once comes from its pristine source to a different source that's an act of violence. And that water is also sacred. We can't shun these things. We can't shun these places where, oh, they're too messed up. They're too this and that. They're too far gone. Like we just kind of give up a lot of things as a lost cause that we're helpless to do anything about it. When in reality, that's where we need to put a lot of our love and attention. So now we come to this is probably about my generation with my kids. And Still, none of this has been talked about. None of this has been acknowledged. We've never had an apology. We've never had any kind of reparations from this harm on Native peoples.
This is hers, this generation's, and she's getting everybody else's.
Close it. So now our children are being born, and you've heard that saying, going from 0 to 60. And it doesn't take very much to set them off. It doesn't take very much for them to take their own life. It doesn't take very much for them to become addicted, to do self-harm, for harm to happen to them from other people, because they're unable to have that power inside to stand up for themselves, that they're sacred, they're beautiful, that they're worthy of all the strength and beauty they possess. So they freeze when abuse happens to them, unable to act because all of their grandmothers and grandparents were unable to act. They didn't have power. This generation, our young people, we have to have a lot of empathy for them. We have to always, I talked about the importance of mentorship that I had with my ko'oi. And that is so special to me because that was denied to those who came before me on purpose. They were disconnected from that connection with their elders, which in turn disconnected them from that learning and that power that they could have growing up with strength in this world. But we have the power. How does that bag feel?
Heavy.
This is what they're carrying today. This is what all of us are carrying, whether you're from the ancestors of the oppressed or the ancestors of the oppressors. That harm did as much damage to everybody, to where we're all experiencing that violence in our homes. We've all experienced that abuse in our families, that sexism, that disempowerment of our own inner spirit, the addictions, the suicides, the poverty, everything that we struggle with in the social justice issues, to where it's not only on us now, but now it's our entire planet, that violence has spread on such a mass scale that it's become a little bit more urgent. There's no disconnection from violence to the land to violence on our bodies. We are this land as indigenous women. Whatever is done to our Earth Mother is done to us. So it's time to start opening that bag. And with that opening and that speaking, we can take out a lot of this weight that our ancestors are dealing with. And maybe now it's like, oh, now I can talk about this. And it's like, oh, I wonder why my father is starting to deal with his addiction. We can talk about what happened to him and get rid of that rock. And it's like, oh, now I never really learned how to communicate with my grandparents, but now I'm like learning my language, and we're slowly starting to communicate again and get that out. So now it's a little bit more manageable, or we're able to kind of go back and look at what we can deal with and heal from in a lot easier way than if this stayed closed and shut and silent. We cannot stand for the silence of the stories of Native people any longer. Our histories in schools are still trying to erase that truth of what happened to us. We have to all, if you have any kind of power, you have to use that to tell that truth-telling of the true history of this country, of the true history of what is continuing to happen. The continued militarization of Indian peoples, the continued exploitation and extraction of our lands and sacred places. All of that is part of this trauma. Historical trauma is the boarding schools, the genocides, the laws, all the stuff that happened. The generational trauma is what actually got recorded in our bodies. Every time our mother was hit, every time we were raped, every time we were abused, that got passed on to our children and is still held in our cells and that memory. The same way as our seeds hold on to memory and can remember.
part that keeps us zestful for life is that we were given knowledges since the beginning. You know, Creator put indigenous peoples in their places for reasons, with knowledges. And in our Toa, Tundi, our Tewa world, there was a old prayer that has been passed down since the beginning, and it says, Namba intum na jam impo and semanya pare iweribo kiripo ibisiki ami hera ibi aki ami hera ibi hege ami hipoki pumbi. And that means the advice since the beginning is to love, to care, respect, and help one another so that things will go good. Now, how simple is that? That's it. That's how we do it. So it's in how we treat one another, and how at this time it's so important that we all find that balance within ourselves. We all have that. We have our dualistic system all the time, which is full circle. You can't have good without bad, hot without cold, man without woman, positive without negative, and we have to find that balance daily. How do we walk that balance? We have a saying also in our saying, Wa kui wa ulambe. And what that means is that in respect to your male warrior part, protector, and your female part, in which we all have. And when we talk saying the male part, that doesn't, and warrior and protector, that doesn't mean violence. It means that because we're Kwiwa, because the women, the love, the care, the nurturing part, that needs to be protected, because that's the how to do it. And that same piece is that strength and the strong part to protect that so that we can walk in that balance. So a lot of the trauma that has happened is, where did this go so wrong? You know, that the interpretation of our heaven on earth, you know, had turned to a very, you know, evil beings, horrible beings, by misinterpreting what the real meaning of warrior and protector, those are just strengths, you know, they're not actions of violence. What happened? So, in order for Native people at this time, it's putting back those beliefs, putting back things that has been taken away from our culture. And, you know, we were born with memories, everybody. And when those memories are triggered, you can do amazing things. And this is the type of work, you know, that we're really working on in all indigenous places. When the children were taken, you know, to the boarding schools, some of them were bloodline spiritual leaders. So it left gaps in our community, in our cultural beliefs, to who's the next ones in line, to take those spiritual leadership roles. So all these generations later, it's putting back those names, and beautiful things are happening when you find your balance and can stay connected to our ancestral energies that are trying to teach us and tell us what's happening in their world is also happening here. They need healing, and they're looking for their tools, in which evidently we are that, to help them heal what had happened to them, because that will help us to go forward with survival for generations to come. So our actions at this time is those simple things of to love, care, respect, and help one another so that things will go good. So that whole understanding of healing and the methods that we use to help those things heal. By, as my sisters say, you need to speak the truth. It's not taught in the schools, but you know what? It's going to have to be taught in the schools. This is the true history of this place. No matter how hard it is to talk about, no matter how traumatic it was, it's the truth. And once you put that truth on the table, then you're able to start teaching how to heal. Giving, first is the truth, and then offering I'm sorry. That's a gift when you're able to have that courage to say I'm sorry. It's also a gift to have that humbling peace to say, I forgive you. It's that simple. And then you're able to sit, look each other's in the eye. How can we go forward now? How can we let it go? How can we put it downstream? And how can we go forward? How can we help each other do this? So in our communities, that's a lot of the work that we're doing is offering forgiveness. Let's do things, help us put back our cultural things. Let's build this adobe house. Let's make another sacred site. Replace those that were taken. And the work is beautiful, but it's also very guided. And a lot of healing is happening because of that. And I feel it happening here.
Can you lift that up? So in addition to the harm that was passed on, this was also passed on to us. A lot of strength, a lot of resiliency, and the proof is that we're still here. That we endured through all of that. We're still growing our own food. We still have a lot of our spiritual ways. We still have our connection to all these things and to our mother. And maybe all that knowledge is a little bit scattered now. So whenever you can support the unity of Native peoples to come together and to share these things with each other. Saturday we're going to be blessed to, thanks to the facilitation of this group, to attend an indigenous event with our mother Anne-Marie in her sacred canyon. That might not have happened if we hadn't have come here. And so I think I'm grateful for that opportunity and that chance for healing and reconnection of how our people used to journey and connect all the time. And we can still reclaim a lot of this that we're not too disconnected from. we're maybe only 3 generations away from when we used to live a little bit more sustainably in what we put into our sacred bodies. You know, it's not that hard to reclaim a lot of the language. How can we facilitate the reclaiming of native languages everywhere? How can we stop the continued development of indigenous peoples outside of Turtle Island? That's happening right now. We heard about Peru last night. We have some power there. So with that, I guess we're finishing right on time, and just remember that even though we carry a lot of this harm, we also carry a lot of strength alongside it that was also passed down to us. And maybe it's not spoken about, but we feel it when we're reconnected with that. And those moments of reconnection, reclamation, revitalization, all of those. Any closing?
You know, there's more, but I think we're on a time limit. So I think we're on a panel this afternoon. So we'll probably continue with this piece here. So there's lots to share. I just wanted to say, I'm a grandma. That's my work. I love my grandchildren. And my little one, she's going to be 3 on Monday. And she was telling me, Grandma, are you going to school? And I said, no, I'm going to go teach. And it's getting difficult to lead them now, because I cherish them, and they cherish me. They love me. I love them. I want to take care of them. They want to take care of me. And that's that hope. And that's her name, Hope. Aurelia Hope. So some of us were able to have this. Our grandparents were able to hide. And they said that when you hear the words, the ego has landed. That's the time to share this with the world. And so in 1970, whatever it was, 78, or whenever they landed on the moon, the ego has landed. We knew we could do sweat lodges, we could come out. And so we have a lot to share, only if you're ready, and only if you want to listen. Because the two of us, we're getting to the point where we're not going to travel much longer. Beata will. She has to carry on the work. And I've been traveling since 1973, doing this work all over. So I can go on, but that's it.
Thank you, everyone that volunteered. You can sit down now. So part of this colonization that happened also put in our minds this linear way of thought, this linear path of time, this disconnection from seasonal time, from natural law. Natural law supersedes any man-made law. And so we have to go back. Can you help me with that? To that circular thought, that spiral of time. So we're going to symbolically leave these chairs here. Maybe our ancestors are going to be sitting here with us, listening to everything. We'll let them have a rest when we're done on Sunday. But we'll have put these around our circle, because we're moving away from this linear way of thinking that's really limited, and how we're going to do this healing. And I also want to give thanks to these stones. I don't mean them any disrespect in using them to represent trauma. A lot of our people are stone people, and so I just want to give thanks to these rocks and these stones and the energy that they're holding. Tonight we're going to put them back and cleanse them, and I just want to offer them that respect for the teaching that they helped us with today.